0, and liftoff.
Hey everybody, welcome to Mission CTRL. This is your host, Ramon Peralta with Peralta Design, and we launch brands. And we've got a great episode on deck for you today. Please join me in welcoming Miss Jamilah Prince-Stewart, the CEO, and Duanecia Clark, Chief Strategy and Communications Officer, both from FaithActs. Welcome.
Hello.
Wow. Good morning and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
And wearing all the gear and the swag and the
We
black.
are well branded. Are you proud?
And you tie in with us too with the colors. Yeah.
Yes.
The mugs look good and everything. So
Cheers.
yes. Big chip right here. We'll Photoshop that one. And be careful.
We'll get that in post. It's fine.
Yes, and be careful. And also let's welcome Jorge Pezo Candelario. He is our right-hand man and the man on the soundboard.
If it sounds right, it's because we did it last night. No, I'm kidding.
Okay, yeah. So Jorge runs our web team here, and we're grateful to have him on the show, and we're gonna have a good one. We got some conversation here about. We'll jump right in the state of the Black church and the relevance of the Black church in 2026.
Yes. You know, we're 10 years old, and I'm sure the big question is, how did y'all decide to work with churches? How did y'all get that done? But the state of the Black church, you know, I know it's on everyone's mind. Everyone is seeing the chaos happening in the country, across the world, trying to make sense of it. And every other article you see is talking about declining attendance at church, the fact that a lot of people are now online. There are videos, you know, poking fun at what is happening in the Black church. Yes. So there's a lot of discussion. And in 2024, September 2024, The Atlantic also did an article basically saying that Democrats can no longer rely on the Black church for votes. So big conversation. And so I think for us, you know, we are making sense of that in our work every day. And for us, you know, we see a different story on the ground. And our work is on the ground, and our work is about relationships. And so, like, what we see in the Black church right now is absolutely, I am a millennial. I'm raising someone in Gen Alpha, I think.
Yes.
And so, you know, my daughter gets really excited going to church because of Sunday school. And she's ready to go to church. She's ready to hang out with her friends. She's ready to see her Sunday school teachers. And so there's an in from a relationship there. But, you know, the work that we do and the work that we see with Black churches, and I would say like Black institutions in general. Shout out to Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated.
Founders Day.
Happy Founders Day. 118 illustrious years. But it's about the Black church. It's about Black institutions. It's about the way Black people mobilize and organize. And for us, the answer is very simple, and it's always power. And so, like, what we have seen, I know people are focused on the mega churches, but what we have seen, the churches on the ground doing the day-to-day work, is we've seen a huge response to what is happening in the country and globally. And, you know, in the pandemic, when Black folks needed to get vaccinated, who did the politicians go to? The Black church.
Yeah.
The majority of my family were vaccinated in my church basement. And when there was food insecurity,
Mount Airy was doing vaccination.
was doing it too.
Pastor Bennett.
Shout out to Pastor Bennett.
Absolutely. You know, food insecurity. Do you guys remember the photos and videos of the food banks and like people rolling up in like their Mercedes Benzes and BMWs? Do you remember that when that was happening? Where did people go to get access to food? Like, how did it hit the ground? It was the Black church. And so the work that we do every day in, every day out, is to make sure that people know what Black churches are actually doing every day. I think another example that I would give is of there's a church in New Haven called Upon This Rock Ministries. And over the past 12 months, New Haven has had a very challenging time thinking about how to serve the housing insecure. In a year, they've built a shelter. They've housed over 400 men. And they found permanent housing for close to 70 of them within a year, right?
Wow.
This is a relatively small church, you know, like not a mega church. It's growing, but this is a lot of young people our age in this church doing this work. And so when people find action in churches when people are introduced to the church, not necessarily just the theology, but the table flipping Jesus that we know. When they get in that way, we see the significance of the church. We're seeing that day in and day out on the ground.
Yeah, I think the disconnect with millennials, and I talk about them in some of my speeches about what can we learn from millennials, and they're about action, and faith without works is dead, right?
James chapter 2 verse 26.
Yes, one of my favorite. And I think that to engage millennials, they've got to see actions, and so FaithActs, great branding. We were talking about the challenges of being a communication officer or strategy for FaithActs. In engaging those millennials, I think that talking about boots on the ground versus the traditional, and I can speak from as a Catholic, the stand up, kneel, pass the basket, and you go home. There's not a lot of action.
What millennials are asking essentially is, what do you do with the power that you have? And how do you transform and change lives in the way that this Bible that you're reading describes? I would also push us to not do the work, especially in an era of misinformation and disinformation, of dismantling our own institutions, right? Jamilah and I both are a part of churches. We are a part of Black institutions that are 100 and 200 years old sometimes. In this era, the dismantling happens subtly. To Jamilah's point about power, the desire to dismantle the power that we have comes in these short form ways where we disregard the corner church in Bridgeport. We don't think about the massive impact of transforming the lives of 300 men in New Haven. Those small pieces matter, and that is how institutions are built and sustained. And so when we discredit that, when we pretend it doesn't matter, when we chalk it up to theologies and practices that sometimes may not hold our own, we make God small, right, in those ways. And so I think it's important for us to expand what it is that we know and honor the truth of what we are seeking. Most of our communities, the power of the civil rights movement, the power of our collectivism as Black people, as women, the least among us, right? This is what the Bible speaks to. Would not be possible without these movements that we've constructed. And so I'm not going to ever disrespect my ancestors or my living elders or the works upon us right now who are sitting and meeting and convening about these things. I won't ever discredit that by giving power to things that I know are not true. When through FaithActs, what I'm seeing is that people are going to the Capitol to make sure kids have money for the tools that they need, that teachers are paid, that teachers who look like them are in front of them, that districts have power, right? That work is happening on the ground and in small ways every single day. And so I think it is important for us to not do the dirty work of pretending like that's not happening because it's trendy to do the opposite.
Yeah, I think you can just brush it off. But I think of what the ask is. Oftentimes when you have power, it's like, well, you got to have an ask. You got to have a call to action. But I also, it's not lost on me that it's my brother, Martin Luther King's birthday.
That's right.
And how being a great orator, and I think of Pastor Bennett. Pastor, shout out to Pastor Kevin Hardy with Man Cave in New Haven, because I was mentioning to you guys, I attended that and it brought up topics of mental health, taking care of yourself, self-care, things that men don't normally talk about. We don't normally go to the doctor unless it's something serious, and how important that is. These are all things that are, I guess, non-traditional church topics. Is that safe to say?
Well, I think that, we have to give credit to what Black churches have been to people. I wouldn't just say Black people, but to people in general for generations. And I think, like the history of the Black church and the role that it played, not just in the civil rights movement, but in the abolition movement. Varick Memorial AME Zion Church was a part of the Underground Railroad. It was a safe space for folks to transition from the South to the North. That history is deeply embedded in those walls, right? right? And so like what we're seeing is like a lived promise, right? And so we've seen in every generation, churches meet the moment of what the people need, whether that's a vaccination, whether that's some other form of healthcare, whether that's the fact that, you know, the history of Sunday school wasn't actually teaching the Bible. It was literally the only place that Black children in the United States were educated when they were not allowed to go into schools. These are places of resistance. These are places where people go for, you know, social events. Like we're seeing a lot of folks like on a Friday night choose to spend their time in church. And so I think, you know, the man cave, the shelters, the food banks, the different ministries has always been a legacy of the Black church. Like people find it as a spot of community. I went to an after school program in New Haven at Dixwell Congregational. You know, I went to an after school program there. That is where I learned how to play the drums. That's where I learned, like, I did a Alice in Wonderland production. I learned how to dance. And so I think that this work has always been happening. It's just important that we own the story, that we tell the story on the ground of what's actually happening.
Absolutely. And on that note, when we come back, we're going to hear about the story behind you two and how you got involved with FaithActs in general. At Peralta Design, social causes are very important to us. One of our trusted community partners and clients is Catalyst CT. Catalyst CT believes in social change that creates a lasting impact on community well-being. Catalyst CT tackles the tough issues that youth, families, and communities often face by preventing street violence, mediating and resolving conflict, improving school climate, boosting mental health, and planting the seeds for a healthy, safe, and restorative life. For more information on Catalyst CT, visit catalystct.org.
We want brands.
And we're back. Please join me once again in welcoming Jamilah Prince-Stewart and Duanecia Clark of FaithActs. You're back. The fans are going crazy.
We're back.
I feel.
Yeah.
We are grateful. Blessed even.
They've been camped waiting for this day. Tell us the story behind FaithActs and yourselves.
Yeah, well, you know, it's a good thing that they're both intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
So if you know anything about me, you know, I am a proud, lifelong New Haven resident. I grew up in New Haven. I was born in New Haven. And I went to school in New Haven. And I'm currently raising the fourth generation of my family in New Haven. And so it is my heart. It is my home. And the story of how my family got to New Haven is actually interesting. So my family's from the Caribbean, but my grandparents grew up in the Bronx and in Harlem, and I'm an organizer. And so you know, when you're a little kid and, you know, there's that family story that you like to hear over and over and over again, the same story, but every time you hear it, it's just like you find
it's your origin story.
Yeah. So I used to love to hear, I call my grandfather Pop-Up. So I'd be like, Pop-Up, tell me the story about the ice truck. That's what I used to say. So, you know, my grandfather, I think it was a hot, like, summer day, and he lived in the Bronx, and you know, back then you used to get ice on a truck, and so the truck wasn't coming to his part of the neighborhood, and so he went and took a truck, brought it to his neighborhood, and started passing out ice to everybody. He was like, you know, king of the neighborhood. He took action because faith acts, right? And so, you know, of course, everyone was very excited, very grateful. But my great grandmother was like, you need to go, right? There's like a warrant out for your arrest. You got to go. And so we had cousins in New Haven. Shout out to the Nevisian folks from Nevis, the population in New Haven that settled here. So we had cousins in New Haven. So that's how we ended up in Connecticut and in New Haven. And as a child, that was the story that I like to hear over and over again. And so, like,
it's like a Robin Hood type guy.
It is. And the story of, like, agitation, the story of, like, take what's yours, you know, take action, that just has always been deeply ingrained in me. And so, you know, being from New Haven, I ended up going to Yale for college. And what's interesting about being a person from New Haven that went to the university is when I grew up, I really walked around the campus. Like, I never walked through. If you go on downtown,
it's all gated.
But the gates are open during the day.
Okay.
So you can, for most places, you can walk through. I think pre-COVID, That's a whole nother story. But you could walk through, but you're taught to walk around. You're taught that these are spaces that you don't belong. And so my family were historically dining hall workers and custodians. Up to the point where I was a student, I still had family members. I had an uncle, not at the time, but that was a custodian, a dining hall worker at the university. And so while I was there, I had to make sense of belonging. I had to make sense of like, do I deserve to be here? And also what got me on this side of the table of the dining room and my cousin stayed on the other, same blood running through our veins, like growing up, same dreams and aspirations of other kids. And so I got a really hard lesson on the power of education. And I think as a young girl, I couldn't make sense of it then, but I can now. I was very frustrated by the anomaly story. Like, you're here because you work so hard, because you're so smart. And not that those things weren't true, because they were. But I was put in positions, I was put in schools, I was put on paths where I could reach my full potential. And I watched so many people, the vast majority of people around me, not be able to do that.
It's like the outlier.
Yeah.
But how do we create more of those opportunities?
And that's celebrated. Like the one who, the path is like, the terrain is impossible to get through, but the one that makes it out, like, let's celebrate that person. And I was just like, no, why aren't we celebrating the fact that the path wasn't easier? Right? Like, why aren't we celebrating the fact that, like, I had to bust my butt to get through it, and my mother had to work 7 days a week and 2 jobs to get me through it? Why are we celebrating that? Why are we not changing that? And so I decided that I wanted to do something different with my degree, and I wanted to sort of figure out how to change this reality for people who look like me. And so I graduated in 2009, so that was an easy choice to make because nobody was getting jobs, because it was like post-2008. Like, I mean, people got letters that were rescinded. No one was getting a job on Wall Street. So if you didn't already decide you wanted to go to med school, law school, or something else, there wasn't much happening. And so I ended up working at an organization in Hartford, Connecticut for a year called Hartford Youth Scholars. Shout out to them. Doing incredible work, placing Hartford students into independent schools. At the time, we were just mostly in Connecticut, but we expanded to more across the country. And while that work was great, we were helping about 30 kids a year. And I still deeply believe in that work. But, Hartford Public Schools still had about 20,000 kids. And so, like, what were we doing about those kids and what they had access to? So then I went to an organization called CONCAN, and I learned a lot about state-level policy work. But when I went up to the Capitol and when I went into the rooms and they were talking about our kids, like Black, Latino, urban kids, and I saw the room, I was like, well, it's just me. Like, and so how are we talking about people and those people aren't a part of the conversation? And so I had this idea I was like, well, churches, everything I learned in school, so going back to Yale, I majored in American Studies with a concentration in American communities and politics. So I took a lot of African American studies courses, sociology courses, political science courses. So I'm like deeply embedded in the history of Black people, in the history of the Black church, and the power that it had in social movements. And so there was a lot of push to get parental involvement, which I thought was important, but a pastor can represent 100 parents. I could bring 10 parents in the room, or I could bring one pastor that represents 100 parents, and then mobilize those people behind that person.
And they're influential.
Extremely influential.
They're great orators, as we said in the first segment, but they're the leaders of the community.
Yeah. And where do politicians go when they want to get votes?
The church. And
then I would often say, when do they come back?
When it's election time again.
And the other answer is never, right?
Right.
And so I started to do that work at that organization, and it grew, and it grew, and it grew, and it grew to the point where one of the pastors, Pastor William McCullough, the founder of FaithActs, said, I want to start my own organization. Like a FUBU type of organization, for us, by us, that is unapologetically of faith, where we're mobilizing and organizing way more faith leaders, but on our own terms, so that we're partnering with other policy organizations, and so that it's not a top-down agenda, but a ground-up.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Duanecia.
What I'm realizing, I've heard Jamilah tell her story hundreds of times at this point. And what I'm realizing is that the intersection of our stories is we were always, throughout the course of our lives, I'm pretty sure there are moments for us as children, deeply concerned with the least among us.
Yeah.
My first act of protest was in the 5th grade. I'm born and raised in Harlem, New York City. And my mother decided I was going to go to school in Washington Heights because there was more community there for us.
More Dominicans too.
More Dominicans, right? And shout out to the Dominicans, right? And so I went to a tiny little school on 168th and Broadway called PS 128, and that's where I was safe, right? And in my first act of protest, because there were so many Dominicans in the school, the graduation song was going to be in Spanish, right? And there were like 3 Black kids, and I was like, absolutely not, right? We not doing this. And so I organized the student body and I protested to the principal, and my mom chose the song and we won, right?
Wow.
We won. And in the end, we ended up singing 2 songs, right? And for me, and to tie this back to
it proved
what I
that
just shared,
your voice could make a difference.
but that the least among us still mattered,
Yes.
right? And that this obsession that we have with majority rule leaves so many people and experiences out. Being a little girl from Harlem, born to a teenage mother, I think about Jesus a lot, right? And what do we say to the women who come into circumstances that they may not be ready for, but still have to do it anyway? I remember my mother turning 22. I remember my mother turning 23, right? And not understanding the gravity of what that meant now as a 36-year-old with a 4-year-old. And I look at my daughter every day and it gives me a new appreciation for my mother, right? The women in our communities, my grandmothers, I was blessed to be raised in part by my great-grandmother. She lived until I was 19. Watching the matriarchs of the community really hold strong and hold fast to what it meant to hold a community together. Watching Black men in my community struggle for relevance, right? My father was a first-generation American from Jamaica. And really, it's complicated to say because his experience is that he's the only one of his siblings born in the United States. My 3 uncles were born in Jamaica, right? And that disconnected experience, but also bringing that flavor to 7th Avenue and knowing that my family was the family that people depended on. My grandmother cooked meals on Sunday, and with a pot of rice and a pot of oxtail, everybody got fed. The block came to the 7th floor to make sure that they can get food. And this concept of community and community care was entrenched in me, but I knew I needed something different, right? I was the child who got her first job at 14. No, I don't know what I was supposed to be doing, but I knew I needed to make money, right? And so I would leave school. I would sometimes cut school to make it to work by 2 o'clock and work a 2 to 10 shift at the supermarket, right? Underneath the projects. In this act of radicalization. And as people, we are organizers by trade. Before I knew there were terms for this, I would allow the women in my community to buy warm meals with their food stamps when their food stamps will only allow them to buy cold food, right? Because they needed to feed their kids. This is just who we are as people.
Yes.
And so the fact that FaithActs can come into my life at that point, I think the 12-year mark of my career in education, and give me the language, right? Give me the idea that people can do this systemically. At 18, I left Harlem, New York City. I got on a Metro North train with my grandmother, and she dropped me off in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where I was a student at the University of Bridgeport. I chartered a chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha on that campus. And that introduction to the middle class opened up an entire world for me that I didn't know existed as a little girl from a certain part of Harlem, right? The fact that wealthy Black people existed and there was a significant world of privilege to absorb. And even on this day, celebrating 20 women who were one generation removed from slavery and decided at Howard University they were going to revolutionize the experience, not just for Black women, but for Black students, right? And take an example and plant seeds for a life that they could not imagine. And now some 118 years later, you have women who have expanded their entire lives and platforms based on something that they didn't even know would come to be all those years ago, right? Yeah. And so I feel a part of that fabric. When I got dropped off in Bridgeport and I met Mount Airy Baptist Church through Reverend Odell Cooper, who at the time was helping Pastor Bennett run the Children's Defense Fund Freedom Schools, I think my path was always going to somehow lead me back to a church. And that experience at Mount Airy's Freedom Schools opened my life to the world of public education. And at that point, I think it was my neo summer, actually, as an AKA, when I did that. I learned that my life was a part of a system. And at that point became obsessed with the fact that we were being played into something that was designed for us through policies and capitalism, right? And that some students were getting outcomes. And at some point in my life, I was one of those students. And so in 2012, when I graduated from the University of Bridgeport, joined an organization called Teach for America. And Teach for America recruits teachers from all across the country to join different communities and become teachers through an alternate route to certification program. And I'm learning about this organization, and in it realized when I was a student, some of my teachers came from Teach for America. And at that 25th anniversary summit, reunited with some of my teachers from that very community in Washington Heights where I started. And as beautiful and harmonious and almost cinematic as that was, it was devastating, right? Because I didn't know, my mother didn't know, my community didn't know that we were a part of a larger system that was feeding us opportunities that may have been lesser than what we deserved and ultimately would not have set us up for success. And so similar to Jamilah, what I decided in that moment was that if people were going to benefit from the networks of Ivy League educated placements inside of school districts, Teach for America at the time was harder to get into than Harvard University, right? Wow. They were only accepting 10% of their applicants. And if you joined staff, I think at that time it was only 8% of people who applied got to be on staff at that organization. Then the hood was going to benefit, right? Y'all were not going to come into communities and decide that Black teachers weren't going to be accepted to this program and get to teach. And so I started Connecticut's first community engagement team, and we took that framework and shopped it nationally, right? What does it look like for these teachers to come into communities and go to the Board of Education meetings and know who the city council leaders are and join boards of the schools and engage thoughtfully? And for me, it comes back to this idea of Sankofa. Go back and get it, right? Get that education, make sure other people can benefit. You don't have to get the deep credential and abandon the space that poured into you. You go back and you get it and you make sure that other people can get it too. And so then at the 10-year mark of my career, I did this really crazy thing where in the same year, I was chief of staff at Teach for America in the DC region. I got married that year. I got pregnant with my daughter that year. And I became a student at Harvard University. And in that degree, I decided that I wanted it to more be the cherry on top of what I had created, more than it was going to define who I am. And I had the experience that a lot of people have, when Black people, when they go to Ivy League institutions. I thought that this was something it's really not. Right? And so I got a master's in education policy and management, met some really incredible leaders, did some really great research, and a lot of work around youth participatory action and what it meant for, again, people to go back and get it, right? That I can get this degree and it can mean something to Harlem, who poured into me for 18 years of my life. It can mean something to Bridgeport, who took me and molded and crafted this experience. It could mean something to Alpha Kappa Alpha in all these spaces. And then this intersection at some point, Jamilah and I got to work together, right? Jamilah and I helped bring schools to Connecticut. We helped make sure teachers felt invested and involved in their experience. We helped people join boards. And we were both AKAs, right? And in the spirit of those same 20 women, right? 9 of them who started this foundation, Jamilah and I were taking that same spirit and deciding to do the same and planting that seed where we were and where it mattered. And so I give a lot of credit to Harlem for raising me. I give a lot of credit to Bridgeport for molding and crafting me. But I love that in the spirit of my ancestors and my elders, my entire purpose has been going back and getting it and making sure that we can teach people how to do the same.
Very strong purpose and why, and an amazing dynamic duo now at the helm of FaithActs. Tell us a bit about what FaithActs is known for, what it's good at, some of the programming, and how you best describe it as an organization.
Yeah. One of the things that you just said, Duanecia, like we're a mission-driven organization. And I just thought about the fact that we are part of this legacy of being committed to doing the work that you have to sacrifice for, work that, you have to have foresight for. You might not be able to see what the end or what the result is, and you might not even be there when it happens, but you still have to be committed to being a part of that chain of justice. And so when I think of FaithActs, I think of that. Like, we are a link in a chain on this long journey towards freedom and liberation. And we have all intersected at the point in which I believe God has put us together to get work done. And so FaithActs, we are people of faith, unapologetically of faith, building power to get our children the education they deserve. And we do that in 3 ways. We build relationships through one-on-one meetings. We believe that our organizing principles, that power is a product of relationship. So even when we're holding decision makers accountable, it starts with relationship. We build leaders, right? So we are deeply invested in the development of our people, right? The learning, the training, the skills to reach their full potential. So it's not just about kids getting educated. It's about the adults who love on them growing as well. And the last, and I would say the most important thing, is we build power, right? So like I said in the other segment, power is always the answer. In times of despair, in times when we're thinking about what's going on with the world, am I safe? Can I go outside, right? Like, will I have food on my table? Will I have a house? Will I have health care? Power, organized power is always the answer. And the definition of organized power, there are 2 types: organized money, which we're working on as a people, and organized people. And so FaithActs is in the business of organizing people. We are focused on education because we understand the history of education and the fight for freedom and liberation. And we believe, and the data also shows us this, that if children are able to get a great education to the point where they are able to attend and matriculate from college, that can transform lives, that can break cycles of poverty, that can train up the next set of leaders to carry on this work. And so we do that work every day. Some people come to that deciding, all right, if I want to get into this, I want to start a school or I want to train teachers. There have to be some folks that are willing to do the brunt work of dealing with the systems work. And so one of the images that we like to talk about, that's a hard one, right? There are babies being thrown in a river, right? They just keep going in. What's your first reaction? What you going to do if you see babies in a river?
Save them.
What are you going to do, though? You're going to
grab them,
pull them out. But you keep doing it, and they keep coming. And so they're just coming. You keep pulling them out, right? What might be a thing you want to do next?
Build a dam and stop the water?
Build a dam and stop the water. And, the other thing is, like, you might want to go see, like, who is throwing the babies in the water? Like, how do we stop?
Yeah.
And that's the point of the dam. Like, how do we stop this? Yeah. And so much of the work that is necessary work is direct service work, right? Mm-hmm. How do we pull the babies out? But somebody's got to go figure out who is throwing the babies in the water in the first place. Mm-hmm. That's the hard work. That's the unseen work. That's dealing with systems. That's dealing with policy, right? That's the long-term work that you may not always be able to see the benefits of. And that's the work that FaithActs does.
Focus on the symptom, but
no.
Gotta get to the root.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I would say at FaithActs, how we do what we do is more important than what we do. And we do things with people. So we don't move without our people. So we take a lot of time building relationships. And I would say the secret sauce of FaithActs and the powers are churches, right? So we start with a relationship with a pastor. And then we build that relationship. We say, hey, can we get access to your church? Can we talk to your people about what the state of our schools is, but also what power you have. Mm-hmm. We say that same thing. When do politicians come here? When do you see them again, right? How do you want to change the dynamics of that relationship?
So you guys go into a church, like,
yes.
And then you're part of the
church
program
by church.
where you
yes.
go to the podium and
yes.
the altar.
Sometimes at the end of church, we'll do, a segment where we'll talk to people, and then we invite them into our meetings with other members of FaithActs from other churches that we've organized and trained. And so what we do is once they do that, we immediately get them into the work. And so part of our teaching is like leaders learn by doing. And so they're being trained to go into meetings with elected officials. They're making demands of those elected officials, and they're seeing the fruits of their labor immediately at Board of Ed meetings and legislative meetings, through policy at the local level and at the state level.
What would be one thing that FaithActs has done that you'd be most proud of?
One. As a non-rule follower, I'll give you 2.
Okay.
We changed the way that schools are funded in the state of Connecticut. In a year where there was, quote unquote, no money, there's always money. We were a part of a coalition and really build power to move $150 million in the budget, primarily to Black, brown, and low-income students in schools. And that was huge. I would say the second thing that we've done is the power thing. The thing that is sustainable is we have a base of 8,000 committed voters. So remember that Atlantic article that said, Black churches are unreliable. First of all, that's a whole nother conversation, but Democrats can't rely on anyone right now because of all that is going on. But, flip that. Black churches are reliable. They are voting. We have proven with our 8,000 committed voters, they vote at 2 to 3 times the rate of their peers and community. And so we have the data. We've done the work to say that Black people vote. Black people decide elections, and Black people will matter in every election at every level, from local to state to federal. And we are training them so that they understand that the election is not the end, it is the beginning. It's a platform on which after they take the action to hold those elected officials accountable.
Awesome. Great works. And I'm gonna pose this question to Duanecia, who is the communications officer. What is the best way for folks to learn more, get involved, share your handles on social and all that?
Absolutely. You can visit us first at faithacts.org. That is your first stop. It'll give you resources, tools. If you are interested in committing to vote, faithacts.org/vote specifically is the place you want to go. You can find your polling place. You can determine whether or not you can vote in the primary election, in the general election. We have both this year. This is not the year to sit out elections. We are electing or re-electing the governor this year in Connecticut. And so you want to make sure you do that. You want to visit us on Instagram at FaithActsEU. FaithActsEU on Instagram.
All right. Excellent. Well, I commend you both and thank you for all the works that you're doing in our community, making the world better. Again, we started off by saying, how can millennials get re-engaged with the Black church? I think when you're taking action like you guys are, it's a compelling reason to get behind some of these social causes that are so important to our communities. Amen. Well, thank you both for being on our show.
Thank you for having us.
All right, everybody. Thank you for watching and listening to this episode of Mission Control. Until next time, this is your host, Ramon Peralta with Peralta Design and